Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here at your 30th anniversary. I am pleased to be able to speak on behalf of UNESCO and to tell you about the work that we do at UNESCO in the area of early childhood care and education and children with, and the inclusion of children with special needs. So during my presentation, I will start with a brief overview of the general early childhood care and education landscape. Then I will review the normative frameworks that we have at UNESCO to support the rights of children with special needs. Then I will talk about what UNESCO does in inclusion in education, which is a broader concept, and then I will focus on children with special needs. And then some UNESCO recommendations. And I will end for some work that we are developing currently in education about moving forward to support countries for ensuring the inclusion of children with special needs. Perfect. So we had a world conference on early childhood care and education 2 years ago in Uzbekistan. This was following a previous world conference of about 10 years ago. That was the first world conference that brought together ministries of education from all over the world to discuss the topic of early childhood care and education, which in our definition, and I think globally, refers to children between 0 and 8. And it also includes all children, including children with special needs. As part of that meeting, there was a declaration that was issued that charged UNESCO to put together a report that took stock of the status of children, of the status of early child care and education, data, statistics, policies, and programs globally. And what you see here is the cover of the report that was released just very recently in June. So I will talk a little bit about some of the major findings in this report globally that we were able to report on. So at UNESCO, we have the global agenda called the Education 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. And we have a sustainable development goal on education that covers all areas of education from early childhood all throughout life. And particularly to pre-primary, there is a goal that countries have committed to ensuring 1 year of free and universal pre-primary education before the start of the official primary school. And what you see here are the regional figures, figures by income groups, and the global figure. And what we found was that despite some little bit of growth over the last 10 years, overall, there's less children participating in in pre-primary, in 1 year of pre-primary, that was the minimum, since previous years. It actually fell by 3 percentage points. So by 2020, it fell to 72%. That's the global rate of enrollment. And you see disparities regionally and by income groups. As you could see, if we start with the income groups, the high income countries have the largest opportunities. Children have the largest opportunities to attend pre-primary. And low and middle income have the fewest opportunities, less than half in low income countries, which leads to issues of exclusion. In terms of regions, we have good enrollment in Central and Southeastern Asia, Eastern and Southeastern Asia, Europe and North America, Latin America, the Caribbean. We never reach 100%, however. The highest was over 90% in 2 regions of the world. Sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Africa, and Western Asia are the regions where children don't have as many opportunities to enroll in pre-primary education of at least 1 year. So this leads to large inequalities globally and differences in opportunities for children to succeed in life. And this is all children, not just those with special needs. If we look at child development, indicators of child development, their physical development, their cognitive development, their social emotional development. These are important milestones for children to be able to succeed in school, but not only socially, economically, and throughout life. Depending on where children live in the world, we see disparities. Globally, only about 70% of children reach their developmental milestones. And we see large disparities, as you can see in the chart, depending on where children live and depending on whether they are growing up in poor or rich families, where they live in terms of rural, regional, rural or urban areas, but less differences between genders, which is a good achievement. One thing that is important for early childhood is to receive stimulation early in life, in particular stimulation in the family with strong relationships with parents or caregivers, opportunities to learn, opportunities to do literacy and numeracy activities. And unfortunately, globally, only about 56% of children receive this type of stimulation. And this could be due for various reasons, having to do with poverty, having to do with lack of access to these opportunities. And so children, not all children globally have access to the optimal growth development that they deserve. And as you will see later, children with disabilities or children at risk of learning disabilities tend to be the most vulnerable in these situations. Let me continue. But we know that if we can provide children with opportunities for participating in early childhood education programs, that will support their development. In this figure that I'm showing you here, we looked at countries where children do not attend early childhood care and education programs and countries where children do attend, and we looked at their development, the proportion of children who are developmentally on track. And you see the picture is very clear that in contexts where, in those countries where children have access to attending at least 1 year of early childhood education, they are more likely to be on track for development. And although there's a range from 50 to over 90%, they are at least hitting the minimum milestones for being on track. So this gives us important information to know that access to early childhood care and education is important for child's development. And when we look at their education outcomes in primary school, early literacy and early numeracy, for example, this chart of data that we have at UNESCO shows that those children who have access to enrolling in pre-primary education tend to have better reading scores by the time they reach grades 2 and 3. So that means they have been able to have those opportunities that prepare them for the transition to primary school and helps them to succeed. As we know, globally, the World Bank had estimated that there is large learning crisis, which they estimated to be about 70% of children post-COVID who cannot reach the minimum milestones in reading. And the minimum reading at age 10, which is to read and understand a simple text. So if by age 10, which is around grades 2 or 3, children are not able to read and understand the simple text, then that puts them on a very challenging path for further education, which then also limits their opportunities for future work and for future education, other work opportunities later on. So it's really important that we provide children with the early support that they need to succeed early in education. So in this report that I'm talking to you about right now, we made the important link between what early childhood care and education can do to support the children who are not developing not having the proper opportunities to achieve early literacy, numeracy, and proper social emotional development. As part of that, those figures I was telling you about around the learning crisis, it was estimated that 37% of the world's children, which in figures refers to more than 300 million children, this is globally, will not reach minimum proficiency levels in reading by 2030, which is the end of our SDG goals. Now, that is a very big number, but we know based on the findings that I've been showing you that if we can provide them access to these early learning opportunities, then early childhood education can support these children to be ready for entering school and to succeed so they're not fallen behind. And we look at it globally in terms of the readiness skills. We're not talking only about academic skills like literacy and numeracy, but also the social emotional development that is very important for the child's well-being, but that are also very important for acquiring the literacy and numeracy skills. So the reason why we look at the social emotional development and the cognitive development of children is because we know that very early on the brain is developing very rapidly, and the brain is shaped by the experiences that children have and the opportunities that they have for rich experiences. So we looked at executive functions which are important for children's development but are also underlying brain mechanisms that support the development of academic skills. But these executive functions are very impacted by the environment around the children. This is why we have measures around early cognitive stimulation of children in our global measurements. But these executive functions are impacted by the environment that children live in. So their economic environment, if they don't have access to materials at home, if they're hungry, and their parents are also not home because they're working, and so they lack interactions with adults. If they live in polluted areas, if they don't have access to clean water or green spaces, all of this will affect the development of the brain, and the executive functions are part of this. And the executive functions are what are important to regulate attention, emotions, and behavior. And these skills in early development are particularly vulnerable children, such as children with disabilities, physical or cognitive disabilities, very much at risk, which is why we look at them and we acknowledge that they are very important to supporting children with important to identify and intervene for children who are at risk so they can get the support that they need to succeed in primary school. And as I was saying, this is what I was just saying now. So what is important is that because we know of how the brain is shaped very early on in their life experiences, both in school and out of school, and the context around them, it is very important for governments to come in and support families, schools, early childhood centers with the programs and policies that will give children these opportunities they would be missing. At UNESCO, we advocate for early childhood care and education opportunities for all children, and we advocate for 1 year of free and compulsory pre-primary education before access to primary education, but in particular for children that are vulnerable or those at risk, such as children with disabilities, children with physical health, cognitive, social, emotional disabilities. It is really important that we have the proper policies and programs to support them because they are the ones that will most benefit from these early interventions, and in particular linking that with school readiness, the the executive functions that support the learning of academic skills, but not just also social emotional development, it is important to come in very early on, and this is coming from the research on brain development that is making this clearer and clearer as new research builds up. So at the end of our report, we have 9 recommendations. The first one obviously being that governments should be promoting early child care and education to prepare young children for that foundational learning, that is that important acquisition of academic skills, particularly literacy, numeracy, and social emotional development before they finish primary school. They should be on track before that so they don't lose out on opportunities later on. And the second most important recommendation was to prioritize the most vulnerable children. And children with disabilities, children with special needs fit in this category, and that was the second most recommendation. Of course, that doesn't go on its own. There's also a recommendation to support parents and caregivers to provide children with these positive home environments. This could be access to free or subsidized care. It could be support for parents with parental leaves. It could be support for teachers to develop skills for supporting the children. We also have some recommendations on having to work specifically hard on children younger than 3, because this is a very critical period, in particular for children who are vulnerable. And there's, of course, the need for governments to spend more on improving the quality of early childhood education. This is global averages, of course. And finally, the right to education that should include access to early childhood, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So now I will talk a little bit about an overview of UNESCO's normative frameworks. Normative frameworks are documents that UNESCO puts together to guide countries all over the world to improve their policies, their legislation, their programs, and particularly around the right to education. And the right to education is something that is not new. It's mentioned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as early as 1948. It's mentioned again in several other normative frameworks or declarations that are instruments used for legislating, but are not legally binding in the sense that once governments then use these documents as guidelines to create their own national frameworks that then become legally binding. The right to early childhood care and education, or the right to positive early childhood experiences, to thrive, to be cared for, to enjoy play and leisure time as a young child, shows up in many of these instruments, including the Convention Against Discrimination in Education, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But unfortunately, in none of these conventions, although the most recent one is from 1989, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, none of them specifically say anything about the right to early childhood care and education. They say the right to education globally, and in most contexts, this means formal education beginning in primary. So a specific mention to early child education has not been made so far, and this is why UNESCO is working on expanding this definition of the right to education. And the reason is because we know that countries that have legislated the right to early childhood care and education tend to be able to support the increase of the most disadvantaged children. In this figure, what you could see is that in a survey of 94 countries that are the member states of UNESCO, there are 63 countries that make early childhood care and education between 0 and 8 free, and another 51 that make it compulsory. And the countries that make it both free and compulsory number only 46 out of 194. So we still have a long way to go. And the reason why it's important to make it free and compulsory is because it will then be able to capture those disadvantaged children. And often case, that means the children that have disabilities or the children with special needs. And in the studies that we've done, when we've looked at these countries that have made it both free and compulsory, we've noticed that, in fact, children are more developmentally on track, and it increases the inclusion of vulnerable children that would otherwise have been excluded. So this is why UNESCO is engaging in work that we call on the evolving right to education. We have several documents that mention how there is the important need to revise or edit or create new normative instruments that would look at specifically including the right to early childhood education and care beginning from age 0 as part of the universal right to education. I've mentioned here a couple of examples. I will not go through them all. And the last one that is on this list is a project that is ending in 2025, where we've gathered the input of many stakeholders globally, stakeholders who work in the right to education, stakeholders who work in early childhood care and education, and stakeholders who work in special education, or stakeholders who work in who support people with disabilities or special needs. And there is a strong ambition to include the right to ECCE in some global international framework. So we're working on this and hoping to get it finalized by 2025. So now I will look at inclusion in education, specifically looking at inclusion broadly and then children with special needs. So for UNESCO, inclusion is a process. As I mentioned before, the SDG 4 on the Sustainable Development Goal 4 on education specifically states to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Very broad statement, but it basically is trying to capture everything in saying that education should be as inclusive as possible. Now, at UNESCO, when we talk about inclusion, we don't just mean children with disabilities or children with special need. It actually means any person, child, youth, adult, who is at risk of exclusion, that we would consider someone who is vulnerable. So it could be people with disabilities. It could also be people with mental health challenges. It could also be children living in disadvantaged contexts, such as developing countries. It could be children living in low-income families. It could be migrants or refugees. It could be people belonging to minority groups like ethnic minorities, religious or linguistic minorities, indigenous populations. It could be children living in rural areas or even in conflict zones. All of these children or people in general are vulnerable, don't have the same opportunities as the rest of us who don't experience these exclusions. And these vulnerable children, when we're looking at education, are at risk of being excluded. So for education, it's a broad definition that also includes children with disabilities and special learning needs. And for us, it's a process. It's a process which is about identifying who these children are in that particular context and removing the barriers that excludes them from education. And it's the idea about making sure that they can be present and participate in all forms of education and providing them with the opportunities to succeed. One thing we also want to raise awareness about is the issue of intersectionality, which is that children who are vulnerable or people who are vulnerable don't usually have just one vulnerability. These vulnerabilities tend to be grouped and make the risk of exclusion even more severe. So depending on where you live, your ethnicity, your gender, your socioeconomic group can make the barrier to education even more difficult because of the intersectionality of all these factors that go together. You're not just one thing. A person is not just one thing or one-dimensional. There are many different dimensions to a person. So it's important to keep that in mind when working on policies or programs for inclusion. So a little bit more about some of our findings about learners with disabilities. This is now about the group of children 0 to 17 years. So it includes the early childhood group. But you will see here, I will not go through all of them, but there's a large proportion, or the numbers are incredibly drastic in terms of the disadvantages that they have for opportunities based on having a disability. So, for example, they are more likely to be to suffer from physical development. They are more likely to experience corporal punishment at home, to feel discriminated against, to feel unhappy. And globally, about 15% of the out-of-school population are those with physical, sensory, or other learning disabilities, and are actually 2.5 times more likely to never have been in school, meaning they don't have these opportunities to learn. These are global statistics. In the case of education, we know that children with disabilities, I mentioned before how important it was for having that cognitive stimulation early on. 25% of children with disabilities are less likely to receive early stimulation and responsive care. They're less likely to attend early childhood education programs. They're less likely to be read to or to read at home. And are 42% obviously then less likely to have those early foundational skills in numeracy and literacy that will allow them to continue into education. And most depressing is that around 1/4 of countries legitimize the provisions of educating children with disabilities in a separate setting, so meaning they are excluded completely from being included in a mainstream school with other children. And this is why our work with the normative instruments is something that we do to support countries to make these changes in their policies and programs. A little bit about COVID, which is that because of the school closures, it has increased the number of children who are vulnerable to be excluded from education, and it deepened the inequalities that were already there. So during COVID, during that first year at least, more than 190 countries closed schools. And during this time, rich countries were able to provide support to children that were out of school so they can continue learning. But children living in low and lower middle income countries, they didn't have access to these continuing opportunities to learn because the countries just weren't able to afford them. So already having vulnerabilities such as a disability or special needs, and then being away from school because schools closed, actually created more inequalities for this already vulnerable group of children. And a word about technology and artificial intelligence. So during COVID, a lot of school systems used technologies, whether it was very fancy technologies like artificial intelligence or simple like text or telephones to support some ongoing learning. And this has been a great benefit for a lot of children, in particular for children with disabilities, to be able to access learning through technology. We got a tour before about the really impressive use of technology for supporting children with disabilities to learn. But it is not the case like this all over the world. And in many parts of the world, there's still not access to basic electricity to be able to use technology, or even a family that can afford a technology or a school system that has electricity to be able to put technologies. So while technology could be a great supporter for children with disabilities, we do have to be careful as a global community to make sure that it doesn't increase the divides or the inequalities globally between countries that are able to benefit, or children that are able to benefit, and those that cannot. And this is the work that UNESCO does to make sure to support those countries that aren't as lucky to help them from falling further behind. So a little bit about inclusion in policy and practice. In terms of policies, in our research, we found that 68% of countries have a definition of inclusive education, as I explained before. But this definition of inclusive education, which I explained before, is very broad. It includes not just children with physical disabilities and special needs, but all vulnerabilities. But unfortunately, only 54 of these countries cover multiple marginalized groups, meaning, for example, migrants or refugees or ethnic or linguistic minorities or children living in conflicts. So what this means is that, as we know, because of the intersectionality of vulnerabilities, that we have to do better to make sure that when we look at policies around inclusion and who should be included in, or how we define inclusion, it is important to remember that inclusion should be a broad definition and not just specific to children with disabilities or special learning needs. I wanted to give you a small example that we thought was really impressive on how governments can work to improve the situation for children. There was this case in Canada, in the province of Ontario, that there was a public inquiry into human rights issues for students with reading disabilities. This was specifically just a reading disability, like a dyslexia, for example, where the child did not receive an early diagnosis and early enough interventions to be able to benefit from a reading intervention early on. And so was failing throughout school. And there was a human rights inquiry, and they explored, tried to understand what happened, and they particularly looked at teacher education. And they found that teacher education, the teacher training institutes were not promoting evidence-based practices on reading approaches. And so what happened was that the child was falling further and further behind and was not able to acquire sufficient reading skills to continue at a good level in further education, and risk being identified. So the commission identified 157 recommendations, which is a lot, meaning there was a lot of improvements to be made in the province to address these systemic issues. And this is an example. I like to give this example because it shows how a community can work together within the right to education to support children with special needs, and in this case, the right to be able to read, which is even more specific than just a right to inclusion or a right to access. It's the right to be able to read, and being able to read is really important to continue in your education. And so it goes to show how it is really important to take a look at the rights of children, in particular those that are vulnerable. And when we want to make a change, that we can, and hopefully this will be a positive improvement for children living in Ontario. So a bit about some recommendations from UNESCO that I hope I have enough time. Someone please tell me if I'm going over. From UNESCO about how we can move into action. So there are 4 main recommendations from UNESCO. I will go through each one very quickly. One is about developing national policy actions for inclusive early childhood care and education. And this means working with governments and working with national agencies to make sure that there are legal frameworks for having all children included in education, not just early childhood education, of course, all of education, but this is the focus on ECCE, so that they are not discriminated from having access. The second one is about actions for educational practices, which is about, it is important that countries use the approaches that meet the needs of the individual child, not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's important to identify learning disabilities through early screening and to work with children's families to provide the support, and to prepare children for transitions to further education. Another action is about training and professional development for early childhood care and education providers and professionals. We need to improve their access to quality tools and approaches. As I mentioned before, learning to read can be a big facilitator for children going forward, and it is important to use science-backed approaches to teaching reading. Teacher education sometimes teaches how to work with children with special needs as a standalone course, but in fact, it's better for it to be integrated into all courses, because inclusion is just children with different vulnerabilities, or just everyone. Everyone can learn differently and on a different time scale. So the idea is for teachers to be able to teach to adapt their teaching and not just teach one size fits all. And it's important that everyone in the school has this knowledge and training, not just the teachers, but also the headmasters. And finally, it's important that the school staff itself is an inclusive workforce, meaning we should be able to open opportunities for teachers with disabilities to be part of a school, and to that would support raising awareness of how it's just part of just everyday life, that people who are different are always part of society. And finally, another UNESCO recommendation which fits well with this institute is the need that we need to continue our research for inclusive early childhood education. We need to better understand children's learning and development. We need to better understand programs and policies that work, and we need to be able to work together collaboratively, of course, to learn from each other in our research activities. So finally, I will talk to you about what UNESCO is doing about inclusion in early childhood education. We know that one of the things that exists in many countries is that there are significant gaps in monitoring and evaluating inclusive early childhood care and education. And so UNESCO is putting together a tool to support countries to assess the extent of their ability to include all children. This is something that is being developed collaboratively with many researchers, research labs globally, and universities. And the idea is to develop a framework that we can use to support countries to assess their policies and their programs, and to take a look at where there might be weaknesses, where there might be challenges, opportunities, strengths, for them to improve their inclusion practices. This is something that is under development. We've begun it, and we will hopefully be able to pilot test in 2025. And it's an objective that is responding to a need that we had identified 2 years ago in our in our world meeting on early childhood care and education. And it's an objective that hopes to accelerate achievement of SDG 4.2, which specifically looks at early childhood care and education. And then a final initiative I wanted to share with you is that earlier I had talked about children's executive functions, and we know this because we work closely with scientists who look at how children develop, and we've learned that the brain functioning early in life is really an important period for children to learn those important skills for later learning. And so we have created a global alliance at UNESCO called an Alliance on the Science of Learning for Education. And this is a group, an international community of practice that brings together researchers, policymakers, and education practitioners to talk together, to break down the barriers between these three groups of stakeholders to be able to better work together specifically for improving curriculum and pedagogies and learning environments. And this is particularly important for vulnerable groups and children with disabilities, because they are the ones who would benefit the most from us learning and improving how children learn and develop, and being able to identify them early on and provide them the interventions that they need. need. So this is open to everyone, including the Institute here, to join us and into coming to work with us on this and learning from each other. The idea is to learn from each other and collaborate in continuing to support our efforts. Thank you.